What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you guys want to support the channel, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up and you'll be supporting the channel. Additionally, you can become a Patreon. Shout out to my high contributing patrons, Newsome and Irrelevant, you guys rock. Now let's get into today's commander with Bello, and this strategy is kind of insane, so stick around. First, let's get into what this guy does because it's kind of insane. This guy's going to turn all of our 4 CMC and above artifacts and enchantments that aren't equipment or auras into 4/4 elemental creatures with haste, and whenever they deal combat damage, we get to draw a card. That's a lot of text and a lot of it's broken. I'm seeing a lot of amazing card advantage in the command zone, which I love. And then we're going to play cards like Gilded Lotus. It's just a 5 CMC artifact that taps for 3 mana of any color. Now, what we're going to do with this strategy is we're actually going to make a Gruul extra turn deck. And now, I know what you're thinking. A lot of the red extra turn spells cuck you and make you lose the game, and we're not going to be using any of them because you are right, those are terrible here. Instead, we're going to use our army of mana rocks that are 4/4 elementals to take near infinite extra turns, or it's going to feel like that to our opponents at least. We're going to use a form of vigilance, or even use Raga Draga here. He's amazing because he's going to buff them all up. Again, these creatures, they're also creatures with mana abilities now. Kind of crazy. And then they attack, untap, or they never tap because they have vigilance. Once we deal combat damage to our opponents, we're going to draw a ton of cards. And then here's where the extra turns aspects comes into play. We're going to tap all of them for mana and then play an extra combat step, which is going to untap them all again. And then we're going to deal more combat damage. Now, eventually, you'd say, aren't you going to run out of cards? Not really, because we are drawing more cards every single time we're doing this because of our commander's ability. Not to mention, again, a lot of this deck is a lot of mana rocks. So we're able to play additional mana rocks, and again, those mana rocks have haste. We just have to ensure that we attack with them for the first time they enter the battlefield, because a lot of the extra combat steps say, a creature that has attacked this turn gets untapped. We're also playing other green untap effects in the deck just to kind of mitigate that. And then other cards in the deck are also pretty busted here as well. We get to play something called Dual Nature. You guys have probably never seen this card, and it's honestly usually pretty bad. But here I think it's kind of funny because you play it the turn you go off, and it's just going to give us double creatures, which is going to double all of our mana rocks. Now, normally you wouldn't want to play this in any deck because it doubles everybody's creatures. So, you know, be careful when you play this, but we're also playing other stuff like Molten Echoes, and this only works on our elemental creatures, so it is just one-sided. Then we get to play other stuff like Mana Echoes, that's going to give us mana whenever we cast an elemental or an elemental enters the battlefield. So again, a lot of these mana rocks are just generic, so we can slam something like a Gilded Lotus and then slam something like a Sisay's Ring right after it, and it's just going to be kind of a Gruul Storm deck that generates a lot of 4/4 creatures that have haste, indestructible, and draws cards. Another thing that's kind of broken that kind of plays off the indestructible aspect is Navendrel's Disc. Now, Navendrel's Disc is an older Magic card, and it doesn't have the text sacrifice it, tap it. So all it does is it taps and then destroys all artifacts, enchantments, creatures, all the good stuff, right? Now, normally in that, you also destroy Navendrel's Disc. That doesn't happen here because Navendrel's Disc has indestructible. Forgot to mention, our commander gives these things indestructible. Kind of insane. Now, this will kill our commander, but we have some ways in the deck to give him indestructible to kind of make sure this doesn't happen. But honestly, this deck generates an insane amount of mana, so recasting a 3 CMC commander is not going to be an issue. Also, Roaming Throne's amazing here, and I know you're like, Roaming Throne's always amazing, but I think it's kind of cool here because we get a double up on all of our artifacts effects. So we're doubling up on everything like our Guardian Projects, and even when the creature deals combat damage, since our commander gives it that ability, we're actually going to get to draw 2 cards. So again, this is kind of an extra turns deck or extra combats deck, whatever you want to say, that kind of draws us into our entire deck, and we're going to beat our opponents to death while doing that. So if that sounds like a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. The first thing we're going to do in this deck tech is talk about the win, the cards you need on the battlefield to go for that insane turn to draw your entire deck. Then we're going to talk about those 4 CMC and above artifacts and enchantments that I think have good enough utility to justify their high CMC. We're going to then talk about the cards we're using to untap all of our creatures and our extra combat spells. Last but not least, we're going to talk about some super synergistic cards that are going to be busted with this commander, so make sure you watch the entire video to get a full effect of what this deck is trying to do. Kicking it off with our win cons, we have Dual Nature and Molten Echoes. If you get these to stick on the battlefield, the win is in your future. Doubling up on all of our mana rocks and then additionally all of our broken enchantments is going to be insane. The value we're going to generate off of these two cards alone will easily put us in a game-winning position, especially when you consider we're running Unnatural Growth and Warstorm Surge. The One Ring and Mana Echoes are also going to be kill on sight cards for our opponents. I've never seen the One Ring hit anybody in the face, but that's exactly what it's going to be doing in this deck. And then whenever we're untapping it with our extra combat steps and our other untap abilities, we're going to be drawing even more cards, allowing us to cast even more spells. And then if these guys let Mana Echoes resolve, that's just going to result in an insane storm turn. I'm talking we cast something like a Gilded Lotus into another artifact that taps for mana, and then it just kind of snowballs from there, especially when you take into account our next strategy, artifact and enchantments that allow us to draw cards whenever a creature enters the battlefield. The Great Hinge, Guruk's Uprising, Guardian Projects, Outcaster Trailblazer, Elemental Bond, Tribute to the World Tree, all of these are going to be amazing. And then if you just so happen to get Mana Echoes on the battlefield at the same time, you're able to play a 4 CMC Mana Rock, generate a ton of mana, and then play another 4 CMC Mana Rock that's going to draw you even more cards and generate even more mana. So we can kind of get to the Storm strategy without ever doing the extra combat steps stuff. Navendrel's Disc is also kind of a win con in this deck, right? It's just super oppressive to play against. All of our creatures and enchantments are indestructible along with our artifacts, so as soon as we blow this up and get rid of our opponent's board and ours is going to be widely ineffective, we're just going to be able to outgrind them, and then any board state they create, we're just going to be able to blow it up again next turn. Aggravated Assault wins several different ways in this deck, most notably if we do get an artifact on the battlefield that's able to tap for 3 mana and then another artifact that taps for 3 mana. As long as those can generate red mana or colored mana, that is just infinite mana and infinite combat steps, and we're going to win the game from there. Notably, it also does go infinite with anything like Sword of Feast and Famine, which we are also running in this deck, so maybe it's a little bit too powerful here and you might be arch enemy for running it, but it's just too perfect for the strategy. I had to include it. But I warned you, if you run this, be prepared to generate a little bit of salt from your opponents. This brings me to our next super fun win con in the deck, Unnatural Growth. Now this thing triggers at the start of every combat, and this is an extra combat step deck, so this kind of makes it a 1-card win con in the deck with a meaningful board state and extra combat spells in our hand. Because what's going to happen is we're going to go to combat, all of our 4/4s are going to become 8/8s. That's amazing, right? But on our very next extra combat step, all of those 8/8s are going to be 16/16s and then 32s 32s. That's going to very easily kill our opponents very quickly. Ashaya is also a win con in this deck, and that may be a head scratcher until you realize we're on Bare Umbra, Sword of Feast and Famine, and Nature's Will effects. Also, side note, Nature's Will, pretty dope here because now it's a 4/4 elemental creature. Wild. Now what's going to happen here is we're going to deal combat damage or attack, whichever, and then we're going to untap all of our lands, but now all of our creatures are lands, right? So this is just another way to enable the strategy where we draw a ton of cards using our commander's ability and all of our mana rocks, and then we're going to untap them all because all of our mana rocks are now also lands. Weird, they're lands, creatures, and mana rocks, and then we get to tap our mana rocks or our enchantments to cast those extra combat steps, and then those extra combat steps will untap all of our creatures again, which will then tap and attack and then untap because of the Nature's Will effects. It's just another roundabout way of getting where we need to get and casting our entire deck while getting near infinite combat steps. Moving on to those other 4 CMC artifacts and enchantments we included in the deck, we have Scepter of Eternal Glory, Ichor Elixir, Gilded Lotus, all very useful cards here. Again, these are just mana rocks that are above 4 CMC that tap for mana. Thran Dynamo, Golem's Eye, Sisay's Ring, continuing the strategy of those 4 CMC artifacts that again tap for mana. Coveted Jewel, kind of cool here because this taps for 3 mana and it's additionally going to draw us 3 great cards. The Immortal Sun is also a card I couldn't resist here. It has amazing utility, it gives us a little bit of card advantage, lowers the cost of all of our artifacts and all of our spells in general, which is amazing in a storm-ish strategy, which is kind of what this deck is. And then additionally, it does give all of our creatures +1/+1. Mana Reflection, very good here because it specifically says whenever you tap a permanent for mana, produce twice as much mana instead. So instead of doubling up on all of the mana our lands produce, this also doubles up all of the mana our artifacts and enchantments are producing as well. Virtue of Strength has very good utility, return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand, and then additionally we can cast it for 7 mana, and then it says if you tap a basic land for mana, it produces 3 times as much mana instead. Very useful in a 2-color deck because we will be running a lot of basic lands. Asceticism has really cool interaction here. Usually all you have to do is remove Asceticism and then you can start removing your opponent's creatures, right? But on our turn, Asceticism is going to have Indestructible, and additionally, it's going to be a creature. So it's kind of a grand abolisher on our turn. They're not going to be able to remove any of our creatures as long as this is on the battlefield. So it's kind of cool to cast this before you go off, and then just kind of take your insane turn. Not to mention, it's just very good protection for our commander because he's going to definitely be a target with this deck. Gratuitous Violence, just being able to double up on all the damage our stuff is doing, pretty amazing. Warstorm Surge, I don't know why that's so hard for me to say, but this thing's basically a 6 CMC Terror of the Peaks, and it's a little bit more flavorful than running Terror of the Peaks itself. It also just gives us amazing spot removal potential and the potential to kill our opponents with this. If we're storming off and casting enough artifacts and enchantments, we could just have enough power enter the battlefield to kill our opponents, especially with a roaming throne on the battlefield. Moving on to the untapped strategy portion of the deck, we have Raga Draga. This is by far one of my favorite pieces in the deck. It buffs up all of our mana rocks because again, they're creatures with mana abilities, and then additionally it's going to untap them whenever they attack, essentially giving them vigilance. The third ability kind of doesn't matter here, but the fact that this does exactly what we want to do while giving us a little bit of a buff is perfect in this deck. Angel's Trumpet is another card I've never seen before, and I'm super excited I found it. This is going to give all creatures vigilance. Yes, our opponents too, so that kind of sucks, but it is going to punish them for not attacking. So for all of their key pieces they don't attack with, they're going to get tapped down, and that's just going to make it easier for us to connect with our creatures and get that card advantage. Curse of Bounty is another card in this deck you have to be strategic whenever you play. I'd only play this card where you're trying to storm off and take a ton of extra combat steps. Now what this card does is it untaps all of your non-land permanents whenever you attack the cursed player. The problem is that's also going to give that ability to all of your opponents as well. So again, try to only cast this spell whenever you're going for the win, or at least kill the cursed player in the process. Mobilize, Vitalize, and Benefactor's Drought are all green cards that just simply say untap all creatures. Again, this is a way we can kind of get around having to attack with our creatures before we're able to untap them with the extra combat steps. That being said, we are running Grim Reaper's Sprint and Savage Beating. These two extra combat spells don't require us to have already attacked with our creatures to untap them, so they're going to be incredibly useful in this deck. Savage Beating is a little awkward because we have to cast it during combat, but it's still going to be amazing here. Relentless Assault, World of War, and Fury of the Horde are all amazing cards here. Again, these ones do require us to already have attacked with our creatures to get that untap effect, but we've kind of built our deck around doing that anyway, so we're completely fine with it. Notably, Fury of the Horde can kind of be free in this deck because we do draw a ton of cards, so much that we will have cards in our hand to be able to discard for its ability to be free. Moving on to our high synergy cards, we have Roaming Throne. This does some insane things in the deck whenever we have Molten Echoes, Mana Echoes, even something like a Natural Growth and Guardian Projects triggering twice can be absolutely huge for us. Leyline Immersion is amazing to enchant onto our commander. Now we're getting additional mana whenever we we untap him, right? Leyline Immersion allows us to tap for 5 mana. That's absolutely insane and will pay for the majority of the extra combat spells in this deck. Plus, it gives our commander a little bit of protection with that ward ability. Speaking of protection, we're also running Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, and Mithril Coat to protect our commander. He's kind of super vital to this strategy. Toski, Bearer of Secrets, and Ornn Frostfang are just going to be doubling up on that card advantage whenever our creatures are dealing combat damage, and that's just going to guarantee that we are drawing into our extra combat spells. I'm also going to be throwing Ugin the Spirit Dragon in this deck. Honestly, this is just kind of one of my pet cards, and in a giant ramp deck like this that's running a ton of colorless artifacts, it seemed like a solid include, especially when we can minus him for 3 to get rid of the majority of our opponent's boards while kind of untouching ours, because a lot of this deck is above 4 CMC. Blasphemous Act, this is going to be amazing here. Again, the majority of our board is going to have Indestructible, so this is kind of a one-sided board wipe in this deck. With all that being said, that's going to bring us to the end of the video. Be sure to let me know down in the comments down below what you think about the overall strategy, and maybe leave some suggestions in the comments down below as well. I'm excited to see what 4 CMC artifacts and enchantments you guys are going to run in this deck. I'd like to shout out my patrons, Newsome, Irrelevant, Chicken Salad, Excessum, and Praetor. You guys are amazing. I hope everybody's having a great day. I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.